This image from Salem, Massachusetts in March 1902 appears to be just another solemn funeral record from the Victorian era. But recent digital analysis has revealed something extraordinary. The real killer was posing as a mourner, hidden among the victim's relatives. The photograph documents the funeral of Eleanor Ashford, a respected 29-year-old librarian who died suddenly from what the local doctor called cardiac collapse. For Salem's community, it was just another premature tragedy. For the killer, it was the perfect moment to hide in plain sight. But this isn't just about a forgotten crime. This is about how modern technology can finally expose secrets that have been hiding for over a century, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. Eleanor Ashford was not an ordinary woman by 1902 standards. Daughter of prosperous merchants, she'd inherited a considerable fortune at 25 and managed the family business alone after her parents died in a carriage accident 3 years earlier. Financially independent women were rare at the turn of the 20th century, especially in conservative Salem where social expectations dictated that unmarried women live under male protection. Eleanor defied these conventions with determination that both impressed and troubled local society. She'd expanded the family business beyond traditional commerce, investing in railway companies and urban real estate speculation. Her investments were managed with mathematical precision, and she maintained regular correspondence with financiers in Boston and New York, a professional network impressive even for men of that era. But this financial independence also made her a target. Eleanor attracted not only romantic suitors but financial opportunists who saw her situation as an opportunity for easy enrichment. In the weeks before her death, Eleanor began suspecting someone was manipulating her investments. Letters found on her desk decades later reveal an analytical mind increasingly concerned with discrepancies in financial reports. A letter dated March 8, 1902, just 7 days before her death, clearly shows her suspicions. The numbers don't match my expectations based on market performance. There are gaps that require immediate explanation. Another letter sent to a Boston lawyer just 3 days before her death is even more revealing. I believe I have discovered systematic irregularities in my financial management. I ask that you prepare legal documentation to confront this situation. There is evidence of deliberate misconduct that I cannot ignore. This correspondence never reached its destination. It was found on her desk, sealed but never sent. Eleanor died in the early hours of March 15, 1902, under circumstances that seemed natural but concealed something much more sinister. Her housemaid Margaret O'Brien discovered the body around 6 a.m. after Eleanor hadn't come down for breakfast, as was her strict custom. Dr. William Crawford described Eleanor's final symptoms as sudden convulsions followed by progressive respiratory paralysis. According to his assessment, Eleanor had awakened during the night with chest pains, called for help, but succumbed quickly before medical aid could arrive. By 1902 medical standards, this clearly suggested acute heart failure. But details in the housemaid's account paint a different picture. Margaret described finding Eleanor rigid as wood, with clenched fists and an expression of absolute terror. She also mentioned a strange odor in the room that she described as bitter, almost medicinal. These details, ignored at the time, are today recognized as classic signs of strychnine poisoning. Strychnine was the preferred poison of sophisticated assassins at the turn of the 20th century. Derived from tree seeds, this substance was easily obtained at pharmacies under the pretext of pest control. More importantly, it caused symptoms doctors frequently confused with heart attacks or epileptic fits. Strychnine poisoning was considered the gentleman's method, effective, relatively quick, and practically undetectable without forensic equipment that wouldn't be developed for decades. The substance interferes with the nervous system, causing violent muscle spasms that can be fatal within hours. So who had access to both strychnine and the opportunity to administer it to Eleanor? The answer was hidden in her own network of family and professional trust. Henry Richmond wasn't a stranger in Eleanor's life. A distant cousin of the Ashford family, he'd been introduced to Eleanor by her father years earlier when she was still a young woman without financial responsibilities. Richmond possessed impressive credentials, accounting training from Harvard University and substantial experience in Boston banking investments. When Eleanor's parents died, it was natural for her to turn to Richmond for financial guidance. For 3 years, Richmond managed Eleanor's investments with apparent competence. The quarterly reports he provided showed steady growth, and Eleanor completely trusted his professional judgment. Richmond visited Salem monthly to discuss investment strategies, maintaining a discreet but regular presence in Eleanor's financial life. What Eleanor didn't know was that Richmond was creating a parallel financial reality, manipulating documents to hide systematic thefts that had begun almost immediately after assuming his responsibilities. Richmond's method was ingenious in its simplicity. He'd created phantom investments in real companies, diverting portions of Eleanor's funds to personal accounts established using false identities. The documents he showed Eleanor were carefully falsified to reflect profits that never existed, while real funds were systematically drained to finance his extravagant lifestyle in Boston. Richmond maintained two completely separate lives. To Eleanor and Salem society, he was the conservative, trustworthy financial advisor. To his Boston associates, he was a risky speculator who spent fortunes on gambling, women, and dubious personal investments. For 3 years, Richmond managed this deception with almost absolute success. Eleanor believed her fortune was growing steadily, while Richmond had stolen almost $12,000, practically her entire inheritance. Eleanor's discovery began seemingly innocently. In January 1902, she decided to diversify some investments and directly contacted one of the railway companies where Richmond claimed to have invested a substantial portion of her funds. The response was devastating. There was no record whatsoever of investments in Eleanor Ashford's name or any entity associated with her. This initial discovery led Eleanor to investigate her real financial situation. She began contacting other companies listed in her investment reports, always discovering the same terrifying reality: her investments simply didn't exist. In February 1902, Eleanor made the decision to hire a private investigator to examine her financial situation independently. Richard Fleming was a former Boston police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases. His credentials included successful investigations of fraudulent investment schemes affecting several prominent families in the region. Fleming's investigation notes, preserved in Salem Historical Society archives and discovered only in 2018, paint a meticulous picture of Richmond's scheme discovery. What Fleming discovered was fraud of impressive sophistication. Richmond hadn't only stolen money from Eleanor, he'd created a complete system of falsified documentation including reports from fictitious companies, forged bank correspondence, and even stock certificates that appeared completely authentic. More importantly, Fleming discovered Richmond had established multiple false identities to facilitate his operations. He operated bank accounts under at least 3 different names, all with apparently legitimate documentation. In his final report dated March 14, 1902, just 1 day before Eleanor's death, Fleming wrote, "Evidence points conclusively to systematic criminal activity by H.R. The methods demonstrate intimate knowledge of the client's business and privileged access to confidential information. I recommend immediate confrontation and urgent legal action. The suspect possesses sufficient resources and knowledge to eliminate evidence if alerted about the investigation." Eleanor Ashford died the following dawn. For Richmond, Eleanor had become an existential threat. Her discovery not only threatened to expose the scheme but completely destroy Richmond's reputation in Boston's financial community. Men in his position depended entirely on trust, and an accusation of theft and forgery would mean not only career destruction but prolonged imprisonment. More importantly, Richmond knew Eleanor's investigations had progressed far beyond initial suspicions. If she had access to Fleming's report, which would certainly happen within days, she'd possess sufficient evidence to guarantee his criminal conviction. The solution Richmond chose demonstrated not only desperation but calculated coldness, suggesting careful planning. He needed to eliminate Eleanor in a way that would seem natural, avoiding police investigation that could expose his fraudulent activities even after her death. Administering strychnine requires precise knowledge of dosage and timing, knowledge Richmond possessed due to university training that included basic applied chemistry courses. More importantly, he had regular access to Eleanor's house under the pretext of monthly financial meetings. The most convincing evidence of Richmond's meticulous planning lies in specific details of how Eleanor was found. Margaret O'Brien reported that Eleanor had complained of a persistent bitter taste in her mouth during the 2 days preceding her death, a classic symptom of gradual strychnine poisoning. Richmond had opted for small regular doses instead of a single fatal dose, a method that would minimize medical suspicions while ensuring the desired result. The timing wasn't coincidental either. Richmond had scheduled a business trip to New York for March 16, creating a perfect alibi, placing him far from Salem when the body was discovered. However, Richmond made a fundamental error. He didn't foresee that Eleanor might have shared her suspicions with others, nor did he anticipate that a professional investigator already possessed detailed evidence of his fraudulent activities. When Richard Fleming tried to contact Eleanor on March 15 morning to discuss his final report, he discovered she'd died during the night. Fleming, a veteran of criminal investigations, immediately suspected Eleanor's sudden death was related to his investigation's findings. He contacted local authorities but encountered significant resistance. Dr. Crawford had already issued a death certificate attributing death to natural causes, and the Ashford family was focused on funeral arrangements rather than questioning circumstances. More importantly, Henry Richmond had quickly returned from his planned trip, claiming he'd canceled New York commitments due to tragic news of his cousin's death. His presence during funeral preparation seemed not only appropriate but necessary. He was, after all, the only financial expert familiar with Eleanor's business. The funeral photograph was commissioned by Eleanor's sister Catherine, following family tradition of documenting important moments. Mortuary photography was considered essential in American culture at the turn of the 20th century, especially for families with sufficient resources to hire professional photographers. Samuel Bennett, the photographer chosen by the family, was widely recognized in Salem for meticulous work and ability to create formal compositions capturing appropriate solemnity for funeral occasions. Bennett maintained detailed records of all photographic sessions, including notes about lighting conditions, composition, and subject behavior. In his notes about Eleanor Ashford's funeral, Bennett wrote observations that only now reveal their true importance. Challenging composition due to high number of participants, irregular light due to intermittent cloud cover. Mr. R arrived at the last moment, necessitating quick reorganization of formation. Subject demonstrated unusual nervousness during preparation. This Mr. R was later identified as Henry Richmond. His late arrival created significant logistical disruption, forcing Bennett to reposition several participants to accommodate Richmond's unexpected presence. What makes this particularly intriguing is that Richmond had initially informed the family he couldn't participate due to urgent professional commitments in Boston. His sudden change of plans and last-minute appearance suggests an impulsive decision based on circumstances he hadn't anticipated. Modern analysis of the photograph reveals why Richmond may have felt compelled to personally participate. Using facial analysis computational techniques developed for forensic identification, researchers discovered Richmond is positioned to maintain direct eye contact with Richard Fleming, who's also present in the photograph. This arrangement isn't coincidental. Richmond had realized Fleming represented a continuing threat even after Eleanor's death. The investigator possessed detailed evidence of financial fraud and had expressed suspicions about Eleanor's death circumstances. For Richmond, eliminating Eleanor had solved only part of his problem. He still needed to neutralize the evidence Fleming had compiled. Richmond's presence at the funeral, therefore, wasn't a demonstration of family grief but an opportunity for assessment and planning. He needed to determine what Fleming knew, what evidence he possessed, and how he could be silenced or discredited. Richmond's body language in the photograph, analyzed through modern behavioral psychology techniques, reveals clear signs of tension and vigilance contrasting dramatically with genuine grief demonstrated by other participants. His hands are rigidly positioned, his posture suggests constant alertness, and his facial expression demonstrates what experts classify as predatory vigilance, characteristic of criminals simultaneously trying to appear innocent while assessing potential threats. Even more revealing, analysis shows Richmond is positioned to observe both Fleming and cemetery exit routes. This strategic position allowed him to monitor the investigator while maintaining escape options should the situation become compromising. But Richmond had underestimated Fleming's persistence and professionalism. The investigator had taken specific precautions to protect his discoveries, including creating multiple copies of his report and evidence deposited in secure locations Richmond didn't know about. 3 days after the funeral, Fleming presented his evidence to local Sheriff William Morrison and Public Prosecutor James Patterson. The material included extensive documentation of Richmond's financial fraud, forged correspondence, and evidence of false identities used to facilitate systematic thefts. More importantly, Fleming had connected Eleanor's sudden death to his discoveries about Richmond, presenting a convincing argument she'd been murdered to prevent exposure of Richmond's criminal activities. Fleming recommended exhumation of Eleanor's body for toxicological analysis, a procedure that could reveal evidence of poisoning. This recommendation terrified Richmond. He knew chemical analyses of Eleanor's body, even with 1902's technological limitations, could reveal strychnine traces sufficient to confirm murder suspicions. Richmond needed to act quickly to prevent exhumation and discredit Fleming's accusations. His first strategy involved political and social pressure on local authorities. As a respected member of Boston's financial community and Ashford family relative, Richmond possessed considerable influence. Richmond contacted prominent Boston lawyers claiming he was being falsely accused by a private investigator of dubious reputation. He presented falsified documentation allegedly proving the legitimacy of his financial transactions with Eleanor. Simultaneously, Richmond initiated a discreet defamation campaign against Fleming, spreading rumors about professional incompetence and questionable financial motivations. He suggested Fleming was trying to extort money from the Ashford family through fabricated accusations. This strategy initially achieved partial success. Local authorities, inexperienced with sophisticated financial fraud cases, were influenced by Richmond's apparent respectability and evidence complexity presented by Fleming. However, Fleming had anticipated this resistance and prepared an alternative strategy. He'd secretly contacted Boston authorities, including Metropolitan Police detectives experienced with complex financial fraud cases. The Boston authorities' analysis confirmed Fleming's findings. Detectives identified multiple irregularities in Richmond's financial activities, including suspicious bank accounts and transactions that couldn't be adequately explained. More importantly, they discovered Richmond had used similar methods to defraud at least 2 other female clients in the previous 3 years. This transformed Eleanor Ashford's case from possible isolated crime to part of an established criminal pattern. Boston authorities issued an arrest warrant for Richmond, charging him with multiple counts of financial fraud, document forgery, and suspected homicide. Richmond's reaction to the arrest warrant was revealing. Instead of presenting himself to authorities or contesting charges through legal channels, he disappeared from Boston the night before the warrant's planned execution. His flight confirmed not only guilt but prior planning of escape strategies in case his criminal activities were exposed. Subsequent investigations revealed Richmond had prepared a complete alternative identity, including falsified documents and financial resources hidden under fictitious names. The funeral photograph of Eleanor Ashford, therefore, represents much more than documentation of a burial ceremony. It's the last known visual record of Henry Richmond before his flight from justice. More importantly, it's visual evidence of his presence at his own victim's funeral, an act of extraordinary audacity demonstrating both criminal arrogance and psychological need to witness the result of his crimes. Modern analyses using facial recognition technologies definitively confirmed Richmond's identity in the image. Distinctive facial characteristics, including a small scar above the left eyebrow and slightly deformed ear from childhood accident, correspond exactly to other known photographs of Richmond from that era. What makes this identification even more significant is the discovery that the photograph had been deliberately altered after initial development. Using microscopic spectral analysis, researchers identified clear evidence of manual retouching in the area around Richmond's figure. Parts of the photographic emulsion were carefully scraped and pigments applied by hand to obscure distinctive facial characteristics. This manipulation wasn't amateur work. The retouching was executed with technical precision requiring specialized knowledge of photographic chemistry and professional laboratory equipment access. This raises a crucial question. Did Richmond execute the alterations personally or did he have assistance from someone with photographic expertise? The answer may lie in Samuel Bennett's financial records. Receipts discovered in Salem Historical Society archives show Bennett received a substantial additional payment of $300 2 weeks after the funeral, an extraordinary amount representing more than his typical 3-month earnings. The payment was made in cash without client identification, contrary to Bennett's usual practice of maintaining meticulous transaction records. More intriguingly, Bennett made a personal notation in his diary on the same date: special work completed. Heavy conscience but financial needs prevailed. This evidence strongly suggests Richmond not only participated in Eleanor Ashford's funeral but also paid the photographer to alter visual documentation of his presence. The perfect crime had been planned down to the smallest details, including manipulation of the only visual evidence that could connect him to his victim's funeral. Richmond's flight marked the end of his physical presence in the case, but not the end of investigation. Authorities continued searching for him for years, following leads from Canada to South America. Unconfirmed reports suggested sightings in Argentina and Brazil, countries that then lacked effective extradition treaties with the United States. Richard Fleming, devastated that his discoveries hadn't arrived in time to save Eleanor Ashford, dedicated the rest of his professional career to locating Richmond. He expanded his investigation internationally, corresponding with authorities in multiple countries. In 1907, 5 years after Eleanor's death, Fleming received a credible report that Richmond had been seen in Buenos Aires operating under false identity as financial advisor to European expatriates. Fleming personally traveled to Argentina, but arrived only to discover the man had disappeared again. This would be the last substantial clue about Henry Richmond's whereabouts. He'd managed to escape American justice and build a new life away from consequences of his crimes. For the families of his victims, including Eleanor Ashford's surviving relatives, this escape represented fundamental injustice that would remain unresolved. The funeral photograph, however, remained as silent evidence of Richmond's presence at the moment of his apparent greatest triumph. For more than a century, this image kept its secrets, waiting for modern technologies to reveal truth hidden in its shadows and reflections. Today, using digital forensic techniques 1902 investigators could never imagine, we can finally see Henry Richmond clearly, not as the respectable financial advisor he pretended to be, but as the killer he really was, audaciously posing among genuine mourners at his own victim's funeral. This discovery not only solves a historical mystery but demonstrates how evidence can remain hidden for generations, patiently waiting for future technologies to reveal truths that seemed lost forever. Samuel Bennett's photograph captured more than a moment of family grief. It preserved definitive proof that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces that can eventually be discovered. If you're fascinated by stories of crime, mystery, and historical forensic discovery, there are hundreds more images waiting to reveal their mysteries. Each photograph tells a story, and some of those stories are darker than we ever imagined.